There's a photograph from 1977. Two little girls, identical twins, sitting side by side on a hospital bed. Their eyes are hollow, empty, staring at something just past the camera lens, something the rest of us can't see. If you look closely at the image, really study it, you'll notice neither girl is smiling, neither girl looks afraid. They look, waiting, like they already know what's coming, like they've been speaking to something the rest of the world refuses to hear. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of Grace and Virginia Kennedy. Born in Columbus, Georgia in 1970, these twin sisters developed their own private language, one so complex, so utterly foreign to the human ear, that linguists who studied them called it autonomous and self-sustaining. But that's the sanitized version, the academic packaging. What really happened in that house on the outskirts of Columbus wasn't just linguistic isolation. It was something darker, something that crept into the bones of everyone who came near them. By the time the Kennedy twins were discovered by authorities at age 6, they were speaking entirely in their invented tongue. They refused English, rejected it completely. Their grandmother, who raised them in near-total isolation, claimed the girls didn't need our words. She said they had their own world, and that she could hear them talking at night, long conversations that sounded almost ceremonial. When social workers finally intervened, they found 2 children who had been left alone for days at a time, speaking only to each other, creating rules and systems and structures no outsider could penetrate. But here's what the documentaries won't tell you. Here's the part that got buried in medical files and sealed court records. In order to save Grace and Virginia Kennedy, to reintegrate them into society, authorities made a decision that haunts the field of psychology to this day. They concluded that the only way to break the language, and the bond that sustained it, was to separate the twins permanently. One sister would be given a chance at a normal life. The other would be institutionalized, forgotten, and in that choice, something ancient and unspeakable was set in motion. The Kennedy twins were born into a family that had already learned how to disappear. Their mother was a young woman, barely more than a girl herself, who vanished from their lives before the twins could form memories of her face. Some records suggest mental illness. Others hint at something the family refused to name aloud. Their father was a ghost in his own right, absent in every way that mattered. That left the girls with their grandmother, a woman the neighbors described as strange and too quiet, living in a house at the end of a dirt road where no one visited and nothing grew. By the time Grace and Virginia were 18 months old, their grandmother had stopped taking them outside. She stopped bringing them to church, stopped answering the door when county health workers came by for welfare checks. The twins grew up in a world of 4 walls, flickering television static and each other. No playmates, no cousins, no interaction with children their own age. Their grandmother fed them, clothed them in mismatched hand-me-downs, and left them alone for hours, sometimes days, while she worked overnight shifts at a nursing home across town. And in that silence, the twins began to speak. At first, it was what any parent might expect, babbling nonsense sounds, the universal music of infancy. But as the months passed, something shifted. The sounds became structured, rhythmic, intentional. By age 3, Grace and Virginia had stopped attempting English altogether. They had created something else. Linguists would later call it an idioglossia, a private language shared only between the twins. But those who heard it, really heard it, said it sounded older than that, like something remembered, not invented. Their grandmother told a social worker years later that she would hear them talking in the dark. Long winding conversations that rose and fell like prayers or incantations. She said it unnerved her at first, the way they would go back and forth without pause, building sentences that had grammar and syntax and rules she couldn't decode. She said she started leaving the television on all night just to drown them out, because the sound of their voices made her feel like she was eavesdropping on something sacred or forbidden. The neighbors, the few who lived close enough to notice, started talking. They said the twins never cried, never screamed, never made the sounds normal children make. They said you could walk past that house at midnight and hear two small voices inside, speaking in unison, like a chant. One woman claimed she heard them singing once, a melody with no words she recognized, and it made her so uneasy she crossed the street every time she passed the house after that. By 1976, when the twins were 6 years old, someone finally called the authorities. A mailman noticed the girls watching him from a broken window, their faces pressed to the glass, mouths moving in perfect synchronization. He said it looked like they were mimicking him, or warning him. He filed a report. 2 weeks later, Child Protective Services arrived at the Kennedy house and found 2 little girls who could not, or would not, speak a single word of English. When linguists from the University of Georgia first listened to recordings of Grace and Virginia Kennedy speaking, they sat in stunned silence. This wasn't baby talk. This wasn't gibberish or echolalia or the kind of twin speech that usually fades by age 4. This was a fully formed linguistic system with its own phonetic inventory, grammatical structure, and what appeared to be an extensive vocabulary. The twins spoke rapidly, fluidly, finishing each other's sentences with such precision that researchers initially thought they were listening to a single speaker on a loop. Dr. Christopher Hagen, the psycholinguist assigned to their case, wrote in his notes that the language had an internal consistency that suggests years of development. He documented over 1,200 unique word forms in just the first 3 months of observation. The twins used verb conjugations. They had tenses, past, present, future. They employed syntax rules that were internally logical even if they bore no resemblance to English or any other known language. When one twin spoke, the other would nod or respond in ways that proved comprehension. They were communicating, fully, completely, in a tongue that belonged only to them. But here's where the story turns cold. Dr. Hagen also noted something else in his recordings, something he only mentioned once, in a memo that was later removed from the public record. He said the twins would sometimes stop mid-conversation and turn toward empty corners of the room. They would gesture, nod, respond to something, or someone, that wasn't there. When he asked their grandmother about this, she went pale. She told him the twins had done that since they were toddlers. She called them the invisible friends. She said there were 3 of them. The medical team tried everything to break through. They used flashcards, picture books, repetition drills. They brought in speech therapists, child psychologists, even a priest who specialized in working with troubled children. Nothing worked. Grace and Virginia would sit politely, stare with those same hollow eyes, and return to their private language the moment they were left alone. They showed no interest in learning English, no curiosity about the outside world. It was as if they had decided, somewhere deep in their shared mind, that the rest of humanity wasn't worth speaking to. One nurse who worked with them during their evaluation period said the twins had a game they played. They would point at people, doctors, orderlies, visitors, and say a word in their language. Then they'd look at each other and laugh, not a child's laugh, something else. The nurse said it felt like they were naming you, categorizing you, deciding what you were worth. She requested a transfer after 2 weeks. By late 1977, the state of Georgia had made a decision. The Kennedy twins could not be rehabilitated together. Their language, their bond, their entire constructed reality was too strong. As long as they had each other, they would never rejoin society, never speak English, never integrate. The system had failed to reach them, so the system did what it does best when faced with something it can't control. It broke them apart. The medical recommendation was clinical, cold. One twin would be separated and placed in an intensive speech therapy program in a facility 300 miles away. The other would remain in a state psychiatric hospital for children with developmental disorders. The separation, they said, was temporary, therapeutic, necessary, but the files tell a different story. The files say the separation was designed to be permanent, that once the language was destroyed, there would be no reason to reunite them. No one asked the twins what they wanted. No one thought to. On a gray morning in March 1978, Grace Kennedy was loaded into a state van and driven north. Virginia was left behind. There are no records of what the twins said to each other in those final moments. No one thought to document it. The staff later reported that neither girl cried. Neither girl resisted. They simply stared at each other as the distance grew, their lips moving silently, still speaking in that language no one else could hear. Grace was placed in the River Bend Developmental Center, a facility that specialized in what they called extreme speech intervention. The philosophy was simple and brutal: total immersion, no contact with her sister, no accommodation for her private language. She would be surrounded by English, drowned in it, until her brain had no choice but to surrender. The staff were instructed never to respond when she spoke in her twin tongue, to treat it like it didn't exist, to starve it of oxygen until it died. For the first 3 weeks, Grace didn't speak at all. She sat in silence, rocking slightly, staring at the wall. The therapists noted that her hands moved constantly, fingers twitching, forming shapes in the air, as if she were still conversing with someone invisible. At night, the orderlies reported, she would whisper into the dark. Long, flowing sentences in that strange, rhythmic language, but there was no one to answer, no echo, no twin voice completing her thoughts. By the second month, something began to break. Grace started making sounds that resembled English. Fragmented, broken, want, no, sister. The therapists celebrated these as victories, progress, evidence that the treatment was working. But the night staff told a different story. They said Grace had started scratching words into the paint of her bedroom wall. Not English words, symbols, marks that repeated in patterns. When they painted over them, she would scratch them again. Always the same sequence. Always in the same order. 300 miles south, Virginia was deteriorating. Without her sister, she stopped speaking entirely. Not in English. Not in their private language, nothing. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally reaching out to touch empty air beside her as if Grace were still there. The staff at the psychiatric hospital labeled her selectively mute and severely withdrawn. They tried medications, behavioral conditioning, isolation therapy. Nothing reached her. She had disappeared into herself, or into whatever world she and Grace had built together. One psychiatrist who evaluated Virginia in those early months wrote something in his notes that was later redacted. He said that during their sessions, Virginia would sometimes turn her head sharply, as if listening to a voice. Her eyes would track something moving across the room, and then she would nod slowly like she was receiving instructions. He requested permission to observe her at night. Permission was denied. 2 weeks later, he resigned from the case. He never explained why. The months passed. Grace learned to speak English, though her therapists noted it was always mechanical and effectless, as if she were performing a script rather than communicating. She stopped scratching marks on her wall, stopped whispering at night. The state declared her a success story, a child rescued from the prison of her own deviant language. But the staff who worked with her said something had gone out of her eyes, that she moved through the world like a ghost, present but not quite alive. Virginia, meanwhile, had been transferred twice, once for behavioral incidents that were never specified in her file, once because a staff member refused to work in her wing anymore. The official reason given was staffing shortage, but a nurse who worked there before the transfer told her sister, off the record years later, that Virginia had started speaking again. Not English, not even the twin language. Something else. Something that made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't articulate. The nurse said it sounded like she was translating. Like she was speaking for something that had always been there, in the space between her and Grace, and now had only Virginia's voice to use. By 1979, the state had made its final decision. The twins would never be reunited. The experiment was over. Grace had been rehabilitated. Virginia had been classified as incurable. And in the files, deep in the sealed sections that wouldn't be opened for decades, someone had written a single sentence in red pen. Recommend no further contact. Psychological risk deemed unacceptable. Grace Kennedy was released from Riverbend in 1982 at age 12. She had learned to speak English. She had learned to make eye contact when required, to answer questions in complete sentences, to mimic the behaviors of a normal child. The state called it rehabilitation. Her case workers called it a miracle, but the foster families who tried to take her in called it something else. They said living with Grace was like living with an echo of a person. That she would sit at the dinner table and stare through you, her lips sometimes moving soundlessly, as if she were still having conversations in a language she'd been forced to forget. She lasted 3 weeks in her first placement. The foster mother reported that Grace would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, not words, not even sounds that resembled language, just raw, animalistic noise that didn't seem to come from a human throat. The woman said she found Grace one night standing at her bedroom window, palm pressed flat against the glass, whispering something over and over. When asked what she was saying, Grace turned with tears streaming down her face and said in perfect English, "She's calling me. She needs me. Why won't you let me go?" The second placement lasted less than a week. Foster father said Grace had tried to hurt herself, that she'd taken a kitchen knife and carved marks into her forearm, the same symbols she used to scratch into the walls at River Bend. When they stopped her, she looked at them with something close to rage and said, "You made me forget how to answer." By 13, Grace was back in state custody, labeled unadoptable. She cycled through group homes and supervised living facilities, always polite, always compliant, always empty. Teachers said she did her schoolwork without complaint, but never spoke unless spoken to. She had no friends, no interests. She existed in a gray space between functioning and collapse, held together by routine and medication, and the state's insistence that she had been saved. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Virginia, locked away in the state psychiatric hospital, had become something else entirely. By the mid-1980s, her file had grown thick with incident reports and observation notes that painted a picture of a child slipping further and further from consensus reality. She still wouldn't speak English, but the night staff reported that she spoke constantly in her room, long, fluid monologues in a language that had evolved beyond what she and Grace had shared as children. It was more complex now, layered, as if she were having both sides of a conversation that Grace could no longer hear. A psychiatric resident who worked her case in 1984 wrote a report that was immediately classified. In it, he described an incident where Virginia had grabbed his wrist during an evaluation and spoken directly to him in her language, slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make him understand. He said her eyes were focused and clear, more present than he'd ever seen her. He said it felt like she was warning him. When he asked a colleague to help translate using the old linguistic recordings from the 1970s, they found that her language had changed so much it was nearly unrecognizable. She had kept speaking, kept building, even without her sister. The language had grown in the dark, but here's what broke him, what made him request an immediate transfer. He said that when he left Virginia's room that day, he heard her laugh. And then he heard a second voice laugh with her, a voice that sounded exactly like hers. When he turned back, Virginia was alone, sitting on her bed, smiling at the empty space beside her. By 1985, the doctors had stopped trying to treat Virginia. They kept her medicated, kept her stable, and waited. Her file notes became shorter, more clinical, less engaged. She was a permanent resident now, a lost cause. The system had moved on. Meanwhile, Grace was turning 18. She would age out of state custody. She would be released into a world she had been trained to live in, but had never belonged to. The social workers prepared her with independent living skills, job placement resources, and a small monthly disability check. They told her she was ready. They told her she'd survived something most people couldn't imagine. What they didn't tell her was that her sister was still alive, still institutionalized, still speaking to ghosts in a language Grace had spent a decade trying to forget. They didn't tell her because the state had decided, years ago, that the sisters should never know about each other again, that the bond between them was too dangerous. That separation wasn't just treatment, it was protection. But some things don't need to be told. Some things are known in the blood, in the space between thoughts, in the dreams that come when the medication finally wears off. Grace began asking about Virginia the moment she was released, and when they refused to answer, she began looking on her own. It took Grace 3 years to find her sister. 3 years of filing petitions with the state, of hiring legal aid lawyers who worked for free, of combing through sealed records and tracking down former social workers who remembered the case. The state fought her at every turn. They claimed patient confidentiality. They claimed it would be therapeutically contraindicated. They claimed Virginia was too unstable for visitors. But what they really meant, what the memos buried in the case files actually said, was that they were afraid of what would happen if the twins were allowed to see each other again. In 1988, a judge finally ruled in Grace's favor. She was Virginia's biological family. She had a right to visit. The state was ordered to facilitate contact under supervised conditions. The psychiatric hospital, where Virginia had spent the last decade of her life, prepared for the reunion like they were preparing for a potential disaster. Extra staff were scheduled. Security was briefed. The session would take place in a monitored room with cameras and a two-way mirror. They would have 15 minutes, no physical contact, no exchange of personal items. The conversation would be recorded. On a cold afternoon in November, Grace walked into that room and saw her sister for the first time in 10 years. Virginia was sitting at a metal table, hands folded in her lap, staring at the door. The moment Grace entered, Virginia's head snapped up. For several seconds, neither sister moved. They simply looked at each other across a distance that was both 3 feet and an unbridgeable chasm of lost time and forced forgetting. And then Virginia smiled, not the empty, medicated smile the staff was used to, something genuine, something that made her look, for just a moment, like the little girl in that photograph from 1977. Grace sat down. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. The staff watching through the mirror reported that the twins maintained unbroken eye contact, their breathing synchronizing, their small movements beginning to mirror each other unconsciously. One clinician noted it looked less like two separate people and more like a single consciousness recognizing itself. Then Grace spoke, in English. Her voice was soft, shaking. "I never forgot you." Virginia tilted her head slightly. Her lips parted, and what came out made every person in that observation room go cold. She answered in their language, the old language, the one Grace had spent 10 years being trained to suppress. Full sentences. Fluid, complex, as if no time had passed, as if the language had been waiting dormant for this exact moment. Grace's face went white. Her hands started to tremble. The staff thought she might be having a panic attack. They were prepared to end the session, but then Grace did something no one expected. She answered back. The words came haltingly at first, like a musician remembering a song they'd been forbidden to play. But within seconds, it flowed. The twins leaned toward each other across the table, their voices overlapping, building on each other, creating harmonies of meaning that no one else in the room could decode. 10 years of forced silence shattered in an instant. The language had survived. It had been waiting in both of them, buried but alive. The supervising psychologist ended the session after 7 minutes. Not 15, 7. She later wrote in her report that allowing it to continue would have been professionally irresponsible and posed significant risk of psychological regression. For Grace, she recommended that no further visits be permitted. But something had already happened. Something the cameras captured but the clinical notes tried to ignore. In those 7 minutes, both twins had transformed. Grace, who had spent a decade moving through the world like a ghost, had become animated, present, alive. And Virginia, who had been catatonic and non-responsive for years, had become lucid, focused, clear. The staff who worked the night shift at the hospital said that after the visit, Virginia wouldn't stop talking. For hours she paced her room, speaking in that language, gesturing emphatically, as if explaining something urgent to an invisible audience. They increased her medication. It didn't slow her down. She kept speaking, faster and faster, until her voice went hoarse. And 300 miles away, in the efficiency apartment Grace rented with her disability check, neighbors reported hearing her voice through the walls all night, having long, elaborate conversations. But Grace lived alone. Grace submitted a petition for another visit. It was denied. She appealed, denied again. She began writing letters to Virginia. The hospital screened them and refused to deliver them, claiming they were written in coded language that could trigger decompensation. Grace wrote to advocacy groups, to disability rights organizations, to anyone who would listen. She said the state had stolen something from her, that she needed her sister, that being separated was killing them both. The hospital administrators reviewed Virginia's case. They noted her decline since the visit, the increased agitation, the regression in her carefully managed medication compliance. They made a recommendation that was filed with the State Mental Health Board in early 1989. The recommendation was simple. Virginia Kennedy should be transferred to a long-term care facility with higher security, a place where visits could be more strictly controlled, where the risk of re-traumatization through familial contact could be permanently eliminated. In other words, they were going to bury her deeper, somewhere Grace could never find her, but they never got the chance. On February 14, 1990, Virginia Kennedy died. She was 19 years old. The official cause of death listed on her death certificate was acute myocarditis, a inflammation of the heart muscle. Natural causes, the report said, sudden but not suspicious, the kind of thing that happens sometimes with long-term psychiatric patients on heavy medication regimens. Tragic, but explainable, except nothing about Virginia Kennedy's death was explainable. The night shift nurse who found her said Virginia had been fine during bed check at midnight, calm, sleeping peacefully. But at 3 in the morning, something woke her. She couldn't say what, just a feeling. When she went to Virginia's room, the girl was sitting upright in bed, both hands clutched to her chest, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but she wasn't looking at the nurse. She was looking at the empty space beside her bed, looking at it like something was standing there, something she could see. The nurse called for help. By the time the doctor arrived, Virginia was already gone. Her body was still warm, her eyes were still open, and her hands, both of them, were covered in scratches, self-inflicted, the autopsy report claimed. But the nurse who was there said something else. She said it looked like Virginia had been trying to hold onto something, that her fingers were locked in a grasping position, like she'd been reaching for someone, or trying to keep someone from being taken away. The hospital called Grace the next morning. She answered the phone in her apartment and heard a stranger's voice tell her that her sister was dead, that it had been quick, that she hadn't suffered. Grace didn't respond. The hospital administrator said later that there was silence on the line for almost a full minute, and then Grace asked a single question. What time did she die? Approximately 3:15 a.m., the administrator told her. Grace hung up. She never called back. She never claimed Virginia's body. She never attended the state-funded burial in the Potter's Field Cemetery, where Virginia was laid to rest with a numbered marker instead of a name. Because at 3:15 that morning, Grace had woken up screaming. Her neighbors heard it through the walls. A sound like someone being torn in half. When the police did a wellness check later that day, after the hospital called them, worried about Grace's reaction, they found her sitting on the floor of her apartment, rocking back and forth, clutching her chest, speaking in that language no one had heard her use in over a decade. She wouldn't respond to English, wouldn't look at the officers, just kept speaking faster and faster, like she was arguing with someone, pleading with someone. She was hospitalized for 3 days. Psychiatric evaluation. They pumped her full of sedatives and waited for her to stabilize. When she finally spoke English again, she told the doctors something that got noted in her file, and then immediately sealed. She said, "Virginia didn't die of a heart attack. They killed her. They killed her because we were speaking again." When asked who they were, Grace looked at the doctor like he was a fool. The same ones who were always there. She said, "The ones who taught us the language in the first place. The ones who needed us together." She was released after 72 hours, diagnosed with acute grief reaction and delusional ideation, prescribed antipsychotics, given a referral to outpatient therapy. She never went. She never filled the prescription. She disappeared from the system entirely. For years, people who knew the Kennedy case wondered what happened to Grace. Some said she'd moved out west. Others claimed she'd ended up homeless, lost to addiction or mental illness. A few researchers tried to track her down for follow-up studies on twin language and separation trauma. They never found her. It was like she'd ceased to exist. But there were rumors, stories that surfaced in the late 90s, in the early internet forums where people shared strange experiences and unexplained phenomena. People claimed to have encountered a woman, thin, somewhere in her 30s, with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much, who would approach strangers in train stations or all-night diners and speak to them in a language that hurt to hear, a language that sounded like it was coming from two mouths at once. They said she was looking for something, or waiting for something. They said if you listened long enough, you could almost understand what she was saying, and it would make you want to forget your own name. In 2003, a linguistics professor at Emory University received an unmarked envelope in his office mail. Inside was a cassette tape, the old kind, the kind no one used anymore, and a single sheet of paper with a note written in shaky handwriting. "This is what we really sounded like, before they broke us, before they made us choose." The professor played the tape. It was two voices, young, speaking in perfect synchronization. The language was complex, layered, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. He listened to the entire 40-minute recording. When it ended, he sat in his office and wept, though he couldn't explain why. He never discovered who sent it. He never made the recording public. He told a colleague once that listening to it felt like eavesdropping on something sacred, something humans were never meant to hear alone. Grace Kennedy would be 55 years old today. If she's still alive, no one knows where. The state of Georgia has no records of her after 1990. No tax returns, no address changes, no hospital visits. She exists now only in sealed files and academic papers, and the memories of people who heard two little girls speaking a language that shouldn't have existed. But sometimes, and this is the part that will stay with you long after you've finished watching, sometimes people report hearing it. That language, Late at night, in empty subway stations or abandoned hospitals or houses where children used to live. Two voices speaking in harmony, building something in the air between them, creating and sustaining a world the rest of us can't see. Some linguists believe the Kennedy twins weren't creating a new language at all. They believe the girls were remembering something older, something that exists in the space between words, in the silence before speech, in the connection between souls who refuse to be separated. The state of Georgia wanted to believe they saved Grace Kennedy, that they broke the language and freed her from its prison. But maybe what they really did was something far worse. Maybe they killed the only thing that made her real. And maybe Virginia didn't die of a heart condition at all. Maybe when you tear apart something that was meant to exist as one, when you silence a voice that was only ever meant to speak in harmony with another, the body simply gives up. The heart simply stops, because some bonds aren't meant to be broken, and some languages aren't meant to be forgotten. They live in the blood, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the dreams we have but can't remember. And they wait.